We are delighted today to introduce John Taylor Chapman, City Council member, founder of Manumission Tours, but we are most excited to brag on him as a graduate of the St. Paul's Preschool. He's a longtime friend of St. Paul's, and I know many of you were delighted that you're here, and I'm going to turn it over to you, John.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. As was said, I started out here, and this community has always been special to me, so it's always a personal pleasure to come back and be with you in this congregation. About 6 years ago, I started a African American tour company, telling the history of African Americans here in Alexandria, particularly in Old Town. Manumission Tour Company is that company, and we've grown a bit. We started out with one tour, now we have 3, and we also do a quarterly bus tour. Because as you know, we have a lot of history here in the city. Regardless of the background of the individuals creating that history, we know we have a lot of it, and we stand on the shoulders of people who have been here before. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was start to tell the story of African Americans and Africans in early Alexandria history and how they contributed to the growing and building up of our community. And so normally I'll do different presentations and talks, but the talk we're going to do is very particular and timely for this Black History Month. There is an organization, ASALH, that usually sends out every year a theme for people to collect around Black history. And this year's theme is Black resistance. And so I wanted to, given the opportunity to speak to you today, gave me an opportunity to kind of dig into what that meant locally here for us in Alexandria. What does Black resistance mean? And while they've given an overall theme and a topic and some verbiage to go along with that topic, every locality is not going to fit perfectly into the mold of what they're looking for. We don't have some of the level of whether it be violence or animosity that you may see in other parts of the country. We do have some issues, we do have some incidents, and so we'll be able to talk about those in a little greater detail. But I'm not going to say that we're going to cover each of the things that you see up there, because the goal with the conversation is really to talk about the Africans, the African Americans, and their resistance to some of the things that are happening. So for example, we know that we have a couple of lynchings here in the city during the 1800s. This particular presentation is not going to go into that because we didn't find, and we haven't been able to find yet, that there's a huge kind of pushback against the lynchings that happen here in the city. We don't, this presentation, and I'm giving a bunch of disclaimers at the beginning, as you can tell. This presentation is not going to go into some of the uprisings that happen in other places in Virginia, such as Nat Turner's revolt. Because while there is some consequences that happen here in the city because of that, there's not a large pushback, there's not a large resistance to some of those issues. So to get right into it, I did want to talk first about some of the earliest examples of resistance, as it were, and a perfect example of great detail of the resistance that we see for the enslaved population is at George Washington Mount Vernon. He has, as you can see here, he documents many times when there are kind of very small issues. These are ways that enslaved people could kind of push back against the owner without getting into, frankly, too much trouble, whether it's slowing down on work, intentionally breaking tools. We see this not only at George Washington's Mount Vernon, but other places in the Deep South. A number of years ago, we went to Charleston, South Carolina to kind of do a little bit of professional development, as it were. And they had similar issues that were talked about with owners. And so we find this happens here, and most likely happened regularly in Alexandria itself. One of the most known ways that early African Americans, particularly those who were enslaved, could push back against that system of slavery is frankly running away. We know here in Alexandria, we have a history of individuals who have run away with the help of Quakers here in the community or tried to run away themselves. We have a couple of examples of some slave advertisements. One of the beautiful things, if you are a history buff, Alexandria Gazette, or back then known as the Alexandria Intelligencer, is a major source of information for Virginia and for the region, frankly. And so a number of slave ads are printed there. They are a main source, a main focal point for information. And so we find that when an owner in the region, particularly in the city, has somebody run away, the first place they go for their ad is to the now Alexandria Gazette. And so we have a nice catalog, as it were, of that information. Who ran away? Where did they possibly go? How much was the prize or reward for capturing them? Those are details that other localities, particularly in the Deep South, don't have great access to because sometimes their press is not as vibrant, as it were, here in Alexandria in the 1800s. And so we're able to see just one example here, but just to give you an understanding of the amount of slave ads we're talking about, the Geography for Slavery website keeps an accounting of slave advertisements that they've been able to research and track down. And so from the period of 1757 all the way till 1803, Alexandria has over 143 slave ads just in the Alexandria Gazette. And that's a pretty fair amount for a city of our size and activity in the late 1700s and into the early 1800s. The one thing that's missing out, of course, then, is what happens after 1803. Here in the city, we do know that we start to have an uptick of individuals trying to run away. If you know a little bit about kind of the demographics of early Alexandria, it's not until 1790, about almost 50 years after our founding, that we actually know the real numbers of individuals here, as well as the amount or percentage of enslaved people here. And so in 1790, when you have the first United States Census, you have a little bit over 2,500 people here in Alexandria. And when I say Alexandria, that is from the water to West Street. And so a little bit different nowadays with the city limits. But within that amount of land, you have 2,500 people. And of that 2,500, you have 538 individuals who are African American or African and they are enslaved. You also have another 59 that are deemed free persons. And the census records say that these individuals are free blacks, but also possibly Native American peoples that are still here in the city. And as many of you know, the history and legacy of this city is our waterfront. And the early founders take great advantage of that waterfront to build out their businesses. And that attracts, of course, other people to the city. And so within the 40 years as we get into the mid-1800s, if you go and look at the census records of 1830, by that time we've doubled the population here in the city. And the percentage of African Americans, roughly around 23% in 1790, has stayed the same. The real interesting difference in the numbers of 1790 and 1830 is that in 1790, you have about 90% of the African American population is enslaved. Another 10 is free. By the time you get to the 1830s and then into the 1840s and before the start of the Civil War, you actually have a 50-50 split within the African American community, meaning that we have a lot more freed individuals who have come here. And we still have 50% that is enslaved. But one of the interesting things that I like to talk about on some of my tours, particularly a tour that we do around the Underground Railroad, is this dynamic that we have as we get into the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, where enslaved African Americans see regularly on the streets freed individuals. This is not, like I say in my tours, they see and know freed individuals. It's not uncommon for them to have a relationship or be able to dialogue with somebody who's free. And as you can imagine, if freedom is a distant thing to you, that yearning for it is probably a little lesser than if you can regularly talk to somebody who's free and frankly be envious of what they have. And so as we get into the 1830s, 40s, and 50s before the Civil War, we see a strong uptick in runaways. We see more advertisements in the local paper. And we will start to see, I'm actually going to go back to that next slide next. We are going to see an uptick in runaways because of the start of the Underground Railroad. When I was growing up here in the city, I never heard conversation or discussion about the Underground Railroad. And in fact, an elder that is African American and regularly works at the museum, after I started the tour company, her and I got into a back and forth about the Underground Railroad actually existing here. I read in an 1872 book, William Still's Underground Railroad, several stories that either started in Alexandria of individuals running away or people passing through the city. And when I mean several, I mean several dozen. And so it wasn't a small occurrence. And I had an argument with this person saying, hey, there must have been something happening here connected to the Underground Railroad. This elder did not want to give up that position. She believed and she had heard that nothing had ever happened here. But we do have evidence that we do have some sites where individuals have run away, and we do believe that we have some places where people stayed during their time passing through this city. And so William Still's book, and his pictures right up here, is an abolitionist. He's an abolitionist from Philadelphia. And his big claim to fame is that he captures over 700 stories of individuals who safely make it up to Philadelphia. And they've come from all parts of the Deep South, including Virginia, D.C., and Maryland. And so we do have a number of stories that connect directly to Alexandria of individuals who have run away. The next time you drive or walk down the 500 block of Cameron Street, there are a number of homes on that particular block that have individuals who have run away and successfully made it. I say that last part because historians still don't know the number of people that possibly ran away and either got captured or had something happen to them during that journey and never made it successfully to a person like William Still that could tell their story. We also know that we have individuals outside of what would be Old Town Alexandria. And the second picture of the slave reward, the $200 slave reward, as you read it, if you're familiar with the city and organizations and schools therein, you'll notice a familiar name and title. Over at Episcopal, they did have enslaved individuals on the campus working for the community, working for individual students as well. And they also had a number of individuals that ran away and successfully made it on the Underground Railroad. And so now, in this day and age, we're able to bring those stories to light and bring them to the mainstream consciousness of folks like yourselves in the city, so that we understand that here in Alexandria, we had a place historically, we had individuals historically working to promote, whether it be progressive change or change things for the lives of African Americans. We also know and want to understand that we have a population of African Americans that are not just content with being enslaved. We have individuals that are actively seeking their freedom when they can. Another opportunity, and actually before I go into that, let me speak about the Edmondson Sisters. The Edmondson Sisters are going to be two individuals that are part of a much larger slave escape in 1848. The slave escape is about 78 enslaved individuals, and they meet on the southwest waterfront of Washington, D.C. And Alexandria at that time is just still going to be getting used to being a part of Virginia. If you know about Alexandria's history and retrocession, in 46 and technically 47, we are moved back into the kind of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so while these women do start out here in Alexandria and move with a number of others over to the Southwest waterfront in DC, we understand that things would still be shifting in the minds of a lot of Alexandrians of being no longer part of Washington, D.C. But that aside, these two women are part of this large group that attempts to, has secured a captain to sail them down the Potomac River and up to Baltimore. Unfortunately for them, and there's actually, let me tell both stories. I'm going to tell you the rumor, which we don't believe is true, and then we'll tell you the real facts. So the rumor is the capture of this boat is partly because one of the sisters has a love interest that she's leaving, and the love interest doesn't want her to leave. And so he tells on her and tells that she's escaping on this boat. We believe, of course, that's probably fiction. Somebody drew that up. But the real fact is, as this boat takes off down the Potomac, it faces very strong headwinds. If any of you have either sailed in the Potomac or been on a boat in the Potomac, it can get quite windy. And this boat, the sailboat, faces these headwinds, and even under the cover of darkness, is not moving very fast. And so it's caught by a number of stations that are set up on the bluffs, both on the Maryland side and the Virginia side. And as we understand it, 2 steamboats are sent after the ship and catch up to the ship very quickly, and are able to get control of the ship and bring it back actually to our waterfront. When it's brought back to our waterfront, these enslaved individuals, 78 of them, are offloaded from the ship, and most of the stories around this particular story tell that there's a gathering of about 200 to 300 Alexandrians that are there to witness the capture of this ship and the offloading of these enslaved, attempted runaways. And so, as I like to tell groups, a group of 78 is much too large to hold at any facility if they're going to be held at a slave jail or some type of place like that. And so the 78 are split up around the region, and the Edmondson sisters come to stay at a Bruin Negro slave jail, which is located on Duke Street. If you're familiar with that building, you may have passed it and not known where it is. If you know where the Whole Foods is up on Duke Street, there is a real estate office right across the street from that. And that building is a historic, original building that has been there since the early 1800s. And that is the site of Bruin Negro Slave Jail. So the women were there at the site for a number of months. And the way slave jails worked back in the 1800s is that individuals, whether family members or unfortunately sometimes slave traders, whoever could purchase the freedom of that person, if it was a family member, you'd be able to get them out. So it's kind of like bail today. But if you were a slave trader, you could actually buy that person's freedom and then trade them or enslave them, further enslave them. And so the father tries to work to get bail. He's unsuccessful, and the Joseph Bruin ends up selling the 2 women down to New Orleans. New Orleans at that time is, shall we say, a very seedy place, particularly for enslaved women of color, if you get my drift. I don't want to go into it because we are in a church. But very luckily for these women, about a month or 2 after they are down in New Orleans, they're actually sent back to Alexandria. Yellow fever strikes New Orleans, and so for some reason, we don't have the details of why, they're actually sent back to Joseph Bruin. This time, when the father finds out that his 2 daughters are back in the city, he engages with Reverend Beecher, a notable Quaker leader at that time, to try to secure enough funds to get the women freed. He is successful in getting the money for them. That money would be upwards of $1,200 in that day, which is a pretty penny. That's probably going to be close to about $40,000 in our day. And so he's able to secure their freedom. And with securing their freedom, because there is a point to this story, the women are actually able to go and be educated. They actually attend Oberlin College in the Midwest. And once they're done with Oberlin, they have their kind of resistance act at that time. They join a group of other abolitionists, and for about a year travel the country telling about the ills of slavery and why it needs to be abolished. And so somebody having gone through what they've gone through are a strong example of the issues with slavery, the injustice of slavery, and they're able to tell that. And so in the larger picture up top, you can barely make out the two women on each end of that picture. And anybody guess, and you can't guess at home, but anybody guess who you notice in that picture as well? A younger version of a certain, that's correct, Frederick Douglass. He is in that picture as well. And he is, as you may know that history, he is doing this tour, this touring around the country talking about abolition and why it needs to be something that happens sooner rather than later. And so the Edmondson sisters have an opportunity to join him and other Quakers and abolitionists in doing that work and pushing back against this system of slavery in the 1850s. As we get into the 1850s, and if you are, any of you are a Civil War buff, Alexandria is an interesting place to kind of look at as it relates to the Civil War. We were captured very quickly during the war due to our proximity to Washington, D.C. As a member of City Council, it's actually interesting to look at how quickly we were captured with a number of different wars. I think it's 1812 and the Civil War. People basically just sail up the Potomac, put guns on Alexandria and say, hey, what are you going to do? That's not the best defensive position for the city. But what that does for us in the Civil War, it kind of ends our portion in that real conflict. Of course, we do have individuals that leave the city to fight in the war, but us as a city really become a base for the Northern Army very quickly. And part of the history, particularly as we talk about resistance for Black resistance, comes when in 1863, a small group of runaway slaves turned themselves in to the Northern Army down at Fort Monroe or Point Comfort in the Tidewater area. These men turn themselves into the Northern Army, and at first the Northern Army leadership doesn't know what to do with them. This is the first time runaway slaves have kind of come to the Army. And the law of the land is actually the Fugitive Slave Act, which means that if you have captured or come across a runaway, you have to turn them back over to their owner. But the Northern Army sees an opportunity to use a little bit of military savvy and strategy by claiming that these individuals, 4 men, are prisoners of war or war contraband. And that means they get to keep them because they're still at war with the South. And so these men become contraband, and the North actually frees them. Word of this gets out to the communities, slave communities in the South. And so during the latter 2.5 years of the war, tens of thousands of runaways make their way to Northern Army bases. And Alexandria being one, we see over 10,000 runaways or war contraband come to this city and give themselves up to the Northern Army. One of the parts that's not talked about when we talk about this story is how big the city is at the time. The city is only 10,000 people at the time. And so we're talking about a doubling of the population in 2 years' time. Even if we, and this would be any elected official's nightmare, to have a population double in that short of a time frame. And as you can imagine, even then, they would have had to have a number of encampments across the city, primarily in the Eisenhower Valley area, if you know where that is. We do know that would have happened in that section of town. The pictures that you have up here is some barracks that are reused from the Northern Army to place a number of these families in. Because the contraband that are coming to the city are not just men, but women and children as well. And so running away from their owners, finding the opportunity and using that opportunity is the way that they can personally push back against this kind of infrastructure of slavery that they've been oppressed under. One of the kind of more interesting pieces to this, and this slide should have probably been up closer to George Washington, because we find out in the late 1700s, mid to late, 1700s, that locally the issue of poisoning is an issue. If you think about it, the enslaved have a lot of access, particularly if you are in the house and if you're cooking, you have access to things, and your duty is to feed everyone. And so, unfortunately, you could have the ability to operate in a different manner if you wanted to. And so we find out here in Alexandria, there is an episode of poisonings. With some of these episodes, we believe this is a way that people push back. We're not condoning this. I don't condone this at all. But it is what happened. And so we find out that a number of slaves are rounded up as they are suspected of being poisoned, being some part of this incident, and they are dealt with in a kind of brutal manner. And after that, it's the piece that's most interesting to me is that there's no local discussion or news about this incident, and primarily for the reason that even today, sometimes we don't talk about, and I'll give you an example, when there is a bomb scare in somewhere, so say like a school, while we might talk about it, we don't broadcast it widely because you don't want copycats. And so we believe that local news, mainly the Gazette, chooses not to kind of run this story and bring kind of local consciousness to what happened here. Oddly enough, this story is actually captured in two different papers, one in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Gazette, and the Georgia Gazette, captured these incidents in the mid 1700s in pretty amazing detail, but nothing locally, which is quite odd. As we get back into, and I apologize for being out of order with that slide, as we get back into the Civil War, and we have a number of contraband come to the city, a number of men are very interested in picking up arms and fighting for the Northern Army. After President Lincoln allows this to happen, you start to see some of these units actually hit the battlefield. Unfortunately, some of them, the early units, are not very well prepared. And so there are a lot of deaths and injuries. And if you know about Alexandria during the Civil War, you know that we are very famous for a number of hospitals that spring up all around Old Town. And the Louverture Hospital, named after Toussaint Louverture, is going to be Alexandria's largest Civil War hospital for African American soldiers. It's actually going to be located on the entire 1300 block of Duke Street and Prince Street. And so if you know where the Freedom House Museum is, that entire block is going to be turned into, if you can see, I'm not sure if you can see I'm just going to point for it. Sorry about it online, you can't see this, but this entire block is going to be the 1300 block, and between the writing, the next block is going to be the 1400 block, and so that's going to take up that entire city block. It's going to be able to accommodate over 1,000 troops during that time. And as you know about early medicine, particularly war medicine, and this is my personal opinion, it's not really effective. And so what we find is a number of men that kind of go under the knife end up having some diseases and infections, and many of them pass away. When they pass away, many of them are sent to what we now know as the Freedmen's and Contraband Cemetery on South Washington Street, where they're buried with other contraband that have come to the city and died because of smallpox and yellow fever. But while they're being buried there, many of their brothers in arms are being buried in a new Alexandria National Cemetery, one of the first military cemeteries in the country under President Lincoln. And that is, if you know where the Wilk Street Cemetery Complex is, it's on the northwestern end portion of that complex. If you don't know where that is, and you ever get a chance to drive all the way down Wilk Street, and you've never seen it, I highly recommend checking it out, because from Duke Street or from some of the highways and byways in the city, you would never know it's back there. And it's a pretty big piece of land. But that aside, their brothers in arms are buried in the military cemetery. And so this starts to rub a number of the soldiers the wrong way, the African American soldiers, particularly those that are in the hospital. And it's not until I want to make sure I get his name right, the funeral of one of their compatriots, Shadrach Murphy, that they push to be buried at the military cemetery with men that they have fought beside. Oddly enough, there is a local reverend who's been deemed in charge of the contraband that makes the decision to say African American soldiers can't be buried in the military cemetery. This is not actually a military policy, which is quite interesting that he'd had this much sway. But these men decide to put together a petition, and you see that on the far left, of about 400 names, and send this petition with wording pretty grand that basically says that they are fellow soldiers of the United States military, and have done everything that their counterparts have done, and wish to be buried alongside them. They send this petition to the quartermaster. The quartermaster, again, has not made any policy that has said we are going to send African American soldiers elsewhere. And so the supervisor of the contraband is summarily fired, and the quartermaster then ensures that African American soldiers can be buried in that military cemetery. Some historians believe that this is kind of the first civil rights action, as it were, of post or kind of since the start of the Civil War. And to try to right a wrong, the Northern Army also goes into the Contraband and Freedmen's Cemetery and unearths about 130 men that were buried there, and reburies them in the National Cemetery. And so the National Cemetery has over 250 United States colored troops in the graves there. And so another act of kind of pushing back against systemic racism and inequity. But our most famous, probably most known action is going to be the 1939 library sit-in. The gentleman you see on the right is going to be Samuel Tucker, a young lawyer that's here in the city. And this all starts when the city builds its first kind of public library in 1938. Prior to that, we mainly had subscription libraries that many of our residents relied on. But this is one where you can walk in the doors and pick up books and read them, or as we do now, get them loaned out to us, and then bring them back in a timely fashion. Got to throw that a little in there. But for this, when this particular branch, the Barrett branch on Queen Street, opens its doors, it's only allowing in white residents. And the initial case that Samuel Tucker makes to the community is that both black and white residents have paid their taxes to have this facility built. And so it would only be fair that everyone who pays the taxes, the communities that pay the taxes, should be allowed to use it. But unfortunately, that is not what's deemed at that time. And so he comes up with an idea to do what we would now call a sit-in, where he, like a good brother, enlists his brother and some of his friends to do the heavy lifting. And that heavy lifting is to dress up in their Sunday best, walk into the Barrett Library, pick out a book, and start to read it, and then see what happens. They know what's going to happen. These gentlemen are going to, at some point, be arrested. And basically, as we understand the story, the librarian kind of doesn't know what to do, so she calls the city manager, and then the city manager calls the chief of police, and sends two officers, or a number of officers, to the library. After trying to get the men to get up and leave without additional issues, and they choose not to, the 5 men are arrested. They are brought out the building, and you see the picture on the left that shows that. What you don't see in the picture on the left is the throng of 200 to 300 people behind the camera, because Samuel Tucker has planned this. So he's let everyone in the community know to come out and see this injustice that's happening in Alexandra's library. Using this type of action to push back against the city and inequity is something else that we have as a local example. Unfortunately, if you know the rest of the story, it's not perfect. The city doesn't necessarily integrate its libraries. It ends up building a separate and smaller library for African Americans. That site on the corner of Alfred and Wythe Street now is our Alexandra African American Museum. And it isn't until the 50s that our libraries are integrated. One that I didn't know when I started this particular project, and I'll make it brief, and some of you may have been here in the city during this turbulent time. In 1970, there was the murder of this young man, Robin Gibson, at a store, I believe a 7-Eleven in the Delray portion of the city. This attracts the attention of the African American community, and for about 3 days, there's a lot of unrest, kind of pushing back on the fact that this gentleman had not been arrested. He was still, he had shot as you can see, a young man, but he was still out roaming the streets. And his story, the story of the 7-Eleven employee, didn't really jive. He said that he was attacked. The man had a number of razor blades that he had put in his bag, even though 7-Eleven didn't sell razor blades. And the facts of the story weren't meshing up. What we come to find out is he actually puts, unfortunately, the employee places a knife along with the body after he shot this young man to make it look like he was an aggressor. But as you can kind of see in the picture in the middle, you have what we call unrest and rioting in the city for about 3 days. After this, or this particular incident, as it quiets down, you have a number of leaders within the African American community that kind of step up to be a go-between, as it were, between the city and the African American community. One such member is a man named Lionel Hope, who ends up becoming, at the time, he's actually running for city council, and actually ends up winning a seat on city council, and actually, if my memory is correct, he is actually the first African American that's elected to city council since Reconstruction, and uses that opportunity to further engage and organize the African American community. You would have others, such as Nelson Green Sr., that would serve a number of years later as well. If you've ever heard of the Secret Seven here in the city, a small group of men that really focused on kind of organizing in the city, talking about what needed to change here in the city. And they are another example of what we see locally as it relates to this particular topic. And so these are some of the examples I came across as we look at the topic of Black resistance and what that means in a local way here in Alexandria. We'll take any questions people have. I know we have a little bit of time to do so. Yes, ma'am.
In some of your slides, you have the price, the bounty on the head of the person that run away. And it was very disparate. One was $20, one
Yeah.
was $200. Any comment as
Sure.
to what determined the value or the bounty that was put on this?
Yeah, and I apologize for kind of doing that without any kind of background. That particular $200 bounty is partly because the gentleman who was responsible for the enslaved was not the owner. He had actually rented out somebody else's slave, and so he placed a much, much higher bounty. That's actually one of the highest ones that we see in any of the slave ads in Alexandria, because he actually has somebody else's property that he does not want to pay a full price for if it is lost. And he actually has to do that. He actually has to pay the initial owner, I believe it's almost $1,200 for the enslaved when they don't come back. But that price is one that shifts a lot. Frankly, and I don't mean to be as kind of basic around this, but I hate to say it, it's almost like people were treated like a commodity. And so the enslaved were property. And so as we look at commodities, even in today, whether it be minerals such as silver and gold, that price fluctuates, and we see that fluctuation in the cost and the price of slaves. And so therein the price of slave ads shifts as well. Many times, if you think an enslaved person might be hiding locally, that cost is going to be very, very low, such as $10 or $20 or $25. If you think they may have friends or family members outside of the city or in another state, you're going to try to raise the reward so that somebody is going to, frankly, take their time out to travel that way and try to find somebody for you. Frankly, trying to entice bounty hunters to do some of that work. Great question. Yes, ma'am.
Probably the most famous slaveholder in the area was George Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't ever hear a lot of backlash about George Washington and slave ownership.
Yeah.
Just in his slave ownership was really early in time compared to this resistance
Mhm.
era that you're talking about.
That's right.
Was there any history or stories about George Washington, slaves resisting, or I know he freed his slaves upon his death. And
Yep.
I thought that was a huge lift.
Yeah.
Died. anything about
So, yeah, absolutely. So let's, one of the things I like to do is remind people that during this time in the 1700s, there is a lot of academia about slavery and slave society. Because it's not just America that's practicing this or has practiced this. You have other countries that have gone through this. And Britain is, as we get into the 1780s, and they're maybe, I think it's about 50 years ahead of where we are and kind of thinking about slave society and coming to that point where they would make slavery illegal in the 1800s. But you have a lot of intellectuals that have said, if you do, frankly, a Google search on British intellectuals, American intellectuals during that time, slavery and the need to have a slave society is hotly debated amongst them. And so it's not unknown that the slave system is a choice. It is a capitalistic choice that these men are making to say that, hey, we have an opportunity to make money, we have an opportunity to grow the American economy, and we're going to do that. I think the backlash, or the lack of backlash sometimes, even in today, is the system of slavery and enslavement is not only large, meaning that it encompasses pretty much everything that happens in America during that time. It's also long, so it goes back not only just to us, but also other communities and other societies as well. And so tackling it and vilifying everyone that did it is something that I don't think we're ready to do as a whole in American society. I think we understand the negative parts about it, the issues that we are still dealing with, whether we want to deal with them or not. I think people are well aware of how slavery's changed the trajectory of America. But I don't know if we, as a whole community, all different backgrounds of us, are really understanding what we would do as it relates to those parts of our history and those men that have made that choice to stand up this system. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Just a question, sort of broader about plantations, historic sites.
Yeah.
I have to visit Sully, it's called Sully Historic Site,
Mhm.
not historic. not
Sully Plantation, right.
Original airport, a friend of mine a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
But I was very struck by the fact that when you went through the mansion, it had sort of mannequins dressed up as members of the Lee family who lived there, but also mannequins dressed up as some of the slaves who served them.
Yeah.
And the docent told us about the stories of the slaves who lived there.
Yes.
With them. And I just wondered if you think that these plantations are doing a better job at
Yeah.
ensuring the history of slavery.
Oh yeah, I think historic sites overall, I mean, and we have our local examples. When I tell folks, when I was growing up here, I think I can't remember how old I was, but I was a Boy Scout and we took a trip to Gatsby's Tavern. There was no mention of enslaved people at Gatsby's Tavern. We talked about John Gatsby, we talked about some of the other stories of people that traveled there, but we didn't see mannequins. I don't remember seeing mannequins. We have seen that shift in historic interpretation, whether it's sites like Sully, sites like Gatsby, or some of our museums that have more information and are not ashamed to share that information because they understand that is a segment of history that we need to talk about because it binds in with the entire story of that site or that museum. We do a disservice to not only ourselves as consumers, but also future generations that are trying to understand how we got to where we are if we're not telling the full story. And so I think they're doing an amazing job. We have here at Gatsby, and I think they run it maybe quarterly, we have a specific tour that talks about the enslaved at Gatsby and what they went through using some of the information and facts that we have. I know there was a couple other questions, and I'll make my answers very quick.
John, how does Alexandria stack up against